Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. My name is Lydia Owen Dodd. I'm the mother of David Dodd, a story that many of you in this room are familiar with, but it was especially meaningful for me to be here with you on this evening, the eve of tomorrow, November 10th, which is the birth date of my beloved son, David Dodd. This year, in the year 2015, I've come back to you to help us commemorate the events, the end of that most uncivil war in 1865. And one of those stories that we want to live on here in Arkansas is of my son, David Dodd. There are still some questions about his death. You see, it all happened so fast. We had evacuated from our home here southwest of Little Rock, between Little Rock and Benton, to the Confederate capital at Camden. By the time we heard about it, those terrible events were done. Oh, we'd hear a family member's recollection or a friend's information or even bits and pieces from strangers. But even now we have questions about my beloved son, David Dodd. The Dodd family, like my own people, the Owens, were considered to be in the mercantile class. I married Andrew Dodd, and he was trying to make some sort of successful business for himself. We moved quite often from our home here southwest of Little Rock. David, in fact, was born in Lavaca County, Texas, on November 10th of 1846. But when my husband, Andrew Dodd, decided to come back to central Arkansas, I was not too terribly displeased. We settled down the road between Benton and Little Rock, southwest of the city, and David was able to go to school in Little Rock at St. John's Academy. David came down with malaria and had to leave school, but he always planned to go back. And until that time, he worked clerking in a store. When the war came, my husband decided that that would be an excellent opportunity and that he could use some of David's skills that he had earned as a clerk. He had decided to become a sutler for the Confederate Army, which, as many of you know, is a supplier of provisions for the Army. And so he took David and they went to Monroe, Louisiana. While he was there, two important things happened. First of all, this portrait was taken of David, his one and only photograph. And there you see him staring straightforwardly into the camera. The other thing that happened was that David worked part-time at the Western Union office. And there he learned the Morse code, which was to figure so significantly into the events that followed. I stayed in Little Rock while they were in Monroe with my daughters. But when the Union Army took the city, David's father sent him to Little Rock to fetch us and bring us out of harm's way. We boarded a boat on the Arkansas River, myself, David, and his two sisters. But also aboard that boat were many, many Union troops. And there I was with a hot-headed young Confederate teenage boy wanting to protect his mother and sisters. It seemed to be a terribly volatile situation, and I made the decision that we would leave that boat and return to our home. And I must bear the responsibility. But that decision held some part in what was to happen. David's father came back from Monroe, Louisiana to fetch us himself, and I wondered, did David feel that he had failed? We evacuated south to Camden, which was the Confederate capital of Arkansas at that time. David's father had various business dealings remaining here in Little Rock, and so he felt that David, being just past his 17th birthday, and being beneath the age which could be drafted into the Army, that David would be safe to come back to Little Rock and conclude my husband's business dealings. And so he provided David with a birth certificate showing that he was underage for the Army. But David still had to go to see General Fagan, the Confederate commander, to get a pass to cross the military lines. General Fagan did provide a pass for David, and perhaps jokingly, perhaps not. He said, "Son, I shall expect a full report upon your return." On the day before Christmas of 1863, David took a mule and began riding towards Little Rock. He stayed with his aunt, Susan Owen, in Little Rock, and being a popular young man, he was invited to all the best holiday parties. At one of those parties, he encountered an old school friend who regaled the young people with stories of his exploits as a Confederate courier. Did David have visions of himself in that role? I'm also told that there was a young lady with whom David danced the night away. Her name was Mary Dodge, and though she and her father, Dr. R.L. Dodge, came originally from Vermont, Mary was described as an ardent little rebel. It was obvious to those who were there that there was an attraction between the young couple. They danced and danced, and finally, David was invited to come calling on Mary at her father's home. They lived in a fine house, but as was the manner in those days, federal officers were quartered in the Dodge home. Among those officers were young men who paid great attentions to a pretty young teenage girl like Mary. Did David resent their attentions to her? But still, when he visited, the afternoons went cordially. The young people, David, Mary Dodge, and the young Union officers all spoke freely. Did they perhaps speak a little too freely? On December 29th, David left Little Rock. He went down the Benton Road to his Uncle Washington Dodd's house. On the way there, he crossed Union lines and surrendered his pass, and since he was not expected to return to Little Rock, he gave up the pass and they disposed of it. David spent the night with Washington Dodd, and then the next morning, instead of just continuing on his way, David doubled back through the woods towards the Benton Road. Was he seeking a shortcut? Was he lost? Or were the Union lines so hopelessly drawn that before he knew it, he was back behind Union lines? The sentries encountered him and demanded to see his pass. David told them that he had surrendered his pass to another group of sentries, but they were nowhere to be found. On David's person, they found his birth certificate, showing that he was underage for military service. They also found something else, a small leather-bound notebook in which were found strange markings of dots and dashes. But ironically, one of the officers who had stopped David had worked in a Western Union office before the war. In fact, ironically, after the war, he was to become the president of the Western Union Company. He knew very well what those dots and dashes represented, and he read them quite easily. They were the exact numbers of troop strength in Little Rock. David was taken to the military prison, which is today at the site of the state capitol. He was court-martialed as a spy and was convicted of treason by a vote of 4-2. His sentence was death by hanging. He was taken to the Little Rock Arsenal on the grounds of today's MacArthur Park. The aristocratic ladies of Little Rock went to see the commandant to plead for David's life. General Frederick Steele was the commandant in the Little Rock area, and General Steele had been accused of being much too lenient on the Confederate populace under his charge. General Steele said that he could not overturn the verdict of the military court. But General Steele had another plan in mind. He went to David and asked David to reveal the name of his informer, and he would let David go free. just to reveal where he had gotten such precise information. In words that have come down to us through the ages, David responded to him, "Sir, I can die for my country, but I cannot betray a friend." General Steele must have had his suspicions because he had put Dr. R.L. Dodge and his daughter Mary Dodge on a federal gunboat and sent them back to Vermont for the duration of the war. Was David's loyalty in vain? The morning of January 8th was one of the most cold and forbidding mornings in the history of Little Rock. The Arkansas River was frozen solid, and people from the north side could walk across to witness the execution. They put David in a wagon where he was forced to sit atop his own coffin. Again, General Steele asked him simply to reveal the name of his informant, and he would let David go free. Still, David did not yield. They rode to the gallows. David's coat jacket was removed and a noose was put around his neck. Again, General Steele implored him to reveal the name of his informer, but again, David refused to yield. At that point, one of the soldiers discovered that they did not have a handkerchief, which was to be used as a blindfold by military law. David nodded to his coat jacket and said, "There's a handkerchief in my pocket." And those were his last words. "There's a handkerchief in my pocket." A gentleman, rather a gentle boy, to the end. In nightmares, I can still see it because it was revealed to us that David's death was neither quick nor painless. The rope in which he was hanged was stretched, and there David dangled for 5 full long minutes, slowly strangling to death. People in the crowd, as well as hardened Union troops, became ill at the sight. But please do not take the word of David's mother. You see, a half a century later, one of those Union troops, Lydia Stillwell of Illinois, a half century later, as he was 73 years old, still remembered the events of that day. He published a book called The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Lydia Stillwell, who was a private in Steele's army, has left an account of that execution, which was burned into his mind a half century later. And I shall quote, "The most painful sight that I saw during the war was at Little Rock. It was the execution by hanging in January of 1864 of a Confederate spy by the name of David Dodd. He was a mere boy, seemingly not more than 19 or 20 years old. Oh, there was no question as to his guilt. When arrested, there was found on his person a memorandum book containing information written in telegraphic characters in regard to all troops, batteries, and other military matters at Little Rock. He was tried by a court-martial and sentenced to the mode of death always inflicted on a spy, namely by hanging. I suppose that the military authorities desired to render his death as impressive as possible in order to deter others from engaging in a business so fraught with danger to our armies. And therefore, on the day fixed for carrying out the sentence of the court, all our troops in Little Rock turned out under arms and marched to the place of execution. It was in a large field near the town. A gallows had been erected in the center of this open space, and the troops formed around it in the form of an extensive hollow square and stood at parade rest. The spy rode through the lines to the gallows in an open wagon, sitting on his coffin. I happened to be not far from the point where he passed through, and I saw him plainly. For one so young, he displayed remarkable coolness and courage in the immediate presence of death. The manner of his execution was wretchedly bungled in some way, and the whole thing was, to me, indescribably repulsive. In the crisis of the fair, there was a sudden clang of military arms and accoutrements in the line not far from me. And looking in that direction, I saw that a soldier in the front rank had fainted and fallen headlong to the ground. I didn't faint. The spectacle, for the time being, well nigh made me sick. It's true that from time immemorial, the punishment of a convicted spy has been death by hanging. The safety of entire armies, even the fate of a nation, may perhaps depend on the prompt and summary execution of the life of a spy. As long as he's alive or may escape, even if closely guarded, might succeed in imparting his dangerous intelligence to others who would transmit it in his stead. Hence, no mercy can be shown. But in spite of all that event in Little Rock impressed me as somehow being unspeakably cruel and cold-blooded. On one side were thousands of men with weapons in their hands, coolly looking on. On the other was one lone, unfortunate boy. My conscience has never troubled me for anything I may have done in the firing line in time of battle. There were other fellows in plain sight, shooting and doing all their power to kill us. It was my duty to shoot at them, to aim low and to kill some of them if possible, and I did the best I could and have no remorse whatever. But whenever my memory recalls Little Rock and the choking of that boy to death, for that's what was done, I feel bad. I don't like to write or think about it, but for fear of being misunderstood, it will be repeated that the fate of a spy, when caught, is death. It was a military necessity. The other side hanged our spies with relentless severity and justified in doing so by the law and usages of war. Even the great and good Washington himself approved of the hanging of the British spy Major Andre and refused to commute the manner of his execution to being shot, the death of a soldier. While the work of a spy is honorable, his fate is always death if caught. No one denies the right of the British to execute Nathan Hale or of General Steele of the Union Army to execute David Dodd. And yet, while the right was his, he might, in consideration of the extreme youth of the offender, have commuted the sentence and kept the boy until danger was past. Private Stillwell of the Union Army overestimated David's age. He was just past 16 years of life, and those years of life came to an end at the gallows in Little Rock. The events transpired so quickly after that court-martial. General Steele said that he'd heard a rumor that the Confederate Army was planning a daring raid to free David. But it was only that, a rumor. And so the execution was carried out. And David now lies in a borrowed grave at Mount Holly Cemetery. We knew nothing of what happened until after David declined to return home, and his father retraced his steps to Little Rock, and it was there that he learned of David's fate. Although we keep him in our hearts, our family was devastated. David's father published several broadsides accusing General Steele of cowardice, but within a year or two, my husband died. General Steele was reassigned, but soon he too was dead. In an irony, General Fagan, who some feel may have set those tragic events into motion, also lies in a grave at Mount Holly Cemetery near our David. As does Dr. R.L. Dodge, who returned to Little Rock from Vermont after the war. His daughter Mary Dodge married another, but even in old age, her son said she remained an ardent little rebel. And so concludes the story of my son, David Dodd. Each year, in the bitter cold of January, the sons of Confederate veterans visit his grave and honor him at Mount Holly Cemetery. And for that I am so grateful, as I'm grateful to each and every one of you who have come here tonight to hear his story on the eve of the date of his birth, tomorrow, November 10th. Even though we lost David, if we remember him, he will live on in our hearts. And this year, in that 150th commemoration of the end of that most un-Civil War, and on the eve of his birthday tomorrow, November 10th, please remember our boy hero of Arkansas, my son, David Dodd. Thank you. Now, those of you who heard the Hattie Caraway presentation know that at this point I would run quickly from the room and make a very fast costume adaptation and come back for question and answers. I regret that in this attire I can do nothing quickly. But I would be very, very happy to answer any questions that you all might have. Sometimes people do have a question about the attire which I am wearing. And please note I do not call it a costume, but attire. It's not vintage Civil War entirely, although the lace around the collars and the cuff came from my grandmother's grandmother and is Civil War vintage, and I'm very proud to be able to have that. The dress itself is all handmade. It is very delicate. Some folks remark on the color, saying, well, that's a very contemporary color of purple. And actually, the color purple, you may recall, has often been referred to as the royal purple. It was only worn by nobility going back to the time of ancient Rome, because originally dyes were only made from very rare plants and small animals like mollusks, and the color purple was the rarest dye of all, which is why the royal purple were the only people who could afford to wear it. But just before the Civil War in the 1850s, a British chemist determined a way to make chemical dyes. They became very popular, and Queen Victoria actually was seen wearing a purple gown. If Queen Victoria wore it, people figured it must be the height of fashion. And so the fashion crossed the pond from Britain to the United States, and the color purple became extremely fashionable for ladies of the upper class or the upper middle class, or as Mrs. Dodd referred to herself, the merchant class. So this would have been the attire worn by an upper middle class lady. It was worn very specifically as what today we might call a fashion statement, because its very impracticality, its very difficulty in moving, would show the world that this was a lady that did not have to work as a laundress or, heaven forbid, out in the fields. The hoop that is worn under this skirt would be considered a medium-sized hoop. Of course, the wider hoops were worn to balls and cotillions, and there was a smaller hoop that could have been worn around the house. Those of you that remember reading Gone with the Wind might recall Scarlett describing her mother and saying that her entire life she never saw her mother's back touch the back of a chair. There's a reason for that. First of all, chairs with arms in them would be a great impracticality, and even if one were to settle oneself into a bench or an armless chair, there is the possibility of an I Love Lucy moment. So a lady would have had to have spent much of her life perched without her back against the back of a chair, perhaps doing needlework or crochet or small sewing items. It was a time of impracticality in dress. And even the men, as many of you in this room know, because I know that you are historians, recognize that when the Civil War started, there was not such a thing as a left shoe and a right shoe. There was simply a shoe. When men went to war, they were issued army boots, not a left boot nor a right boot, but a boot. And the theory was that your foot would conform to the shape of the boot, or the boot would conform to the shape of your foot. But imagine marching up to 40 miles a day with a full field pack. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, there was at least an equal number of casualties of the Civil War from illness and infection and disease, as was killed by the enemy's bullet. One of those things we look upon today as being awfully uncivilized. But marching those boots, neither left nor right, for up to 40 miles a day, carrying a full field pack, many of the men developed blisters on their feet, which became infected, and they died of blood poisoning. And of course, we look back on those uncivilized times and say, well, that could not have happened in the 20th century. But again, as historians know, that one of our United States presidents, his son, was playing on the White House tennis courts and developed a blister on his foot, and 10 days later was dead of blood poisoning. And that was President Calvin Coolidge. And so those were the kinds of things that our ancestors dealt with. Not only the horror of war, but also doing it in extremely uncomfortable clothing. But it's an honor to be able to wear this attire and to remind us of what our ancestors went through 150 years ago when that war ended. There's a story that at Appomattox, when General Grant and General Lee met to sign the surrender papers of the Army of Northern Virginia, that there was a colonel on General Grant's staff, a Colonel Eli Parker, who was a full-blooded Seneca Indian. He was superbly educated and actually had handwritten the terms of the surrender. He was renowned for his skills and for his education and his erudition. And when General Lee entered the room, he bowed courteously to Colonel Eli Parker and said, "My compliments, sir, to the only real American in the room." Colonel Parker bowed back courteously to General Lee and said, "My compliments to you, sir, but we are all Americans now." And so as we look back on those most uncivil days of an uncivil war, I thank you all so much for coming tonight to hear a story which resonates so closely to those of us who live here in this area. And many of you have stories of the Dodd and Owen families who lived southwest of Little Rock. And I think Steve has some insights into that, and I'm hoping that he will share them with us.